Story 1. A Halloween night terror. Elias Thorne considered himself a man of logic, order, and deep, abiding dislike for October 31st. Tonight, at 10:30, Blackwood Hollow was a sonic soup of cheap plastic crunching on driveways, adolescent screams, and the constant, dull thud of bass from a party 3 blocks over. Elias, wrapped in a threadbare wool cardigan and sipping weak tea in his darkened living room, felt a familiar, comforting sense of isolation. He lived in the oldest house on Hemlock Lane, a sprawling Victorian with gables that looked like angry eyebrows and a porch swing that groaned even in still air. He had turned off every light, ignored the persistent ringing of the doorbell until it finally ceased, and now presided over his self-imposed darkness. A subtle, non-electronic sound broke through the neighborhood din, a scraping. It was a thin, dry sound, like fingernails dragging across coarse wood, and it came from his porch. Elias grumbled. Probably a drunk teenager leaving some tacky plastic garbage. He decided he would wait 5 minutes, then investigate with his heaviest fireplace poker. 5 minutes passed, and the silence from the porch was heavy and unnatural. Elias stood, his knees popping, and crossed the room to the front window. He peeled back the edge of the heavy velvet curtain just enough to survey the damage. The porch was empty of trick-or-treat bags, toilet paper, or any of the usual detritus of a raucous Halloween. Instead, centered perfectly on the top step, was a jack-o'-lantern. Elias frowned. He hadn't bought a pumpkin this year. He had deliberately skipped the annual squash massacre that his neighbors indulged in. This wasn't just a pumpkin, it was a masterpiece. It was perfectly spherical, a deep, saturated orange, and carved with terrifying, masterful precision. Its eyes were not simple triangles, but elaborate, multifaceted slits that gave the impression of constant, calculating alertness. But it was the mouth that held his gaze. A vast, thin, stretched grin, showing rows of impossibly tiny, sharp, jagged teeth. It was a smile of pure, exquisite cruelty, illuminated by a steady, flickering yellow light. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Elias unlatched the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was colder here, carrying the sharp, sweet smell of burnt sugar and something else, something earthen, rich, and distinctly metallic. He knelt by the pumpkin. The skin was cool and smooth beneath his fingertips, not mushy like the gourds that had been sitting out since mid-October. He leaned in, peering at the precision of the carving. How had anyone achieved such detail? The teeth looked almost laminated, polished to a hard shine. As he stared, the flickering light within seemed to brighten, casting the shadow of the jagged grin directly across his face. He could have sworn the line of the mouth, already wide, stretched just a millimeter further, an expression of deepening enjoyment. Clever, Elias muttered, standing up. Some neighborhood prankster. He decided it was too well executed to destroy immediately. He scooped up the pumpkin, noted its surprising weight. It felt heavier than a bowling ball, and carried it inside, placing it on the small mahogany side table in the hall. The moment the jack-o'-lantern was across the threshold, the entire atmosphere of the house changed. The air went still, and the distant sounds of the Halloween party seemed to recede, muffled as if cotton had been stuffed into Elias's ears. All that remained was the silent, watchful glow of the pumpkin. Elias walked to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. He could still see the glowing reflection of the pumpkin in the dark window glass. He stopped, suddenly unsettled. He had just turned his back on the house, and he felt intensely observed. He went back to the hall. The pumpkin was exactly where he left it. But the light inside it wasn't flickering anymore. It was steady, like a small, captive sun. And the expression had undeniably shifted. It was no longer cruel, but smug. Patient. Elias felt a prickle of genuine fear, cold and sharp. This wasn't a prank. The smell, which he recognized now as the odor of damp earth and old blood, was stronger. He took a step forward, intending to throw the pumpkin into the yard, smash it with the poker, anything to break the spell. Click. The lock on the front door, which he had left slightly ajar, snapped shut with an audible metallic finality. Elias reached for the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. He yanked. He twisted. He shoved his shoulder against the wood, but the door was utterly sealed. Panic, a sensation entirely foreign to the logical Elias Thorne, began to bubble up. He spun toward the pumpkin. "All right, whatever this is," he began, his voice surprisingly shaky, "it stops now." He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy bronze paperweight shaped like an owl, and raised it above his head. He brought it down with savage force on the top of the jack-o'-lantern. The impact was not the satisfying, wet crunch he expected. Instead, it was a dull, sickening thud, and the bronze paperweight bounced off, leaving not a scratch, not a dent, but a tiny, glistening, sticky patch of orange moisture. The pumpkin's grin widened again, stretching impossibly until the top curve of the smile brushed the lower edges of its calculating eyes. The light inside pulsed, a brief, joyful flicker. Elias stumbled back, the paperweight clattering to the floor. The impossible resistance confirmed his dread. This was not wood, not squash, not plastic. It was something grown, but not by a farmer. He retreated to the living room, grabbing the heavy, iron fireplace poker. He looked at the vast, curtained windows, high, narrow, and designed to keep the world out. Scrape. Drag. The sound was back, but now it was closer, sounding wet, like heavy burlap being dragged across wet stone. It was coming from the second floor. Elias froze. He lived alone. He looked back at the hall. The pumpkin was casting a shadow that didn't match its shape. The shadow was tall, spindly, and crowned with a wide, tattered hat. It looked like a silent scarecrow perpetually bent over in worship of the glowing gourd. Elias crept up the curving staircase, the poker gripped so tightly his knuckles were white. The smell intensified with every step. The metallic, earthy odor of the pumpkin, mingled now with a hint of mildew and hay. On the landing, the sound stopped. He checked the bedrooms, the guest bath, and his study. All were exactly as he had left them. Empty. But as he reached the end of the hall, he noticed the attic door. It was low, set into the ceiling, usually sealed tight with two heavy brass latches. One latch was undone. The other was swinging gently. Elias raised the poker. The attic had always been a dead space, filled with 80 years of accumulated dust and nothing else. He reached up slowly and pushed the wooden panel. It didn't lift easily. It felt heavy, as if something dense were resting on top of it. He pushed again, harder, and the panel groaned and slid upward, revealing the black maw of the attic space. A puff of cold air, utterly still and smelling only of deep, ancient dust, escaped. Elias waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing moved. He took one more look toward the staircase, checking for the shadow scarecrow. He saw only the reflection of the pumpkin's light illuminating the banister. With a surge of desperation, he hoisted himself through the opening and onto the rough plank floor of the attic. He fumbled for the pull chain to the single bare bulb. Click. No light. The bulb must have burned out. Elias lowered himself into a crouch. The darkness here was absolute, deeper and thicker than the darkness in the rest of the house. He could hear his own ragged breathing, and the frantic drumming of his pulse. Then, from the far corner of the attic, where the ceiling slanted down to the eaves, he heard it again. Scrape. Drag. But this time, it was accompanied by a wet, clicking sound, like mandibles closing. Elias held his breath. He had to see. He had to know. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, flipped on the flashlight function, and held the phone rigid in his left hand, the poker ready in his right. He swept the beam across the stacks of rotting boxes and mildewed furniture. The light stopped on the corner. There was a figure there. Tall, impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like heavy, decaying burlap. It was kneeling over a pile of something that glistened wetly. The figure turned its head, and the light caught its face. It had no skin, only tightly woven vegetable fibers, sinewy strands of pumpkin vine and dead leaves wrapped around a skull-like structure. Its eyes were two burning coals set deep in the sockets. But the mouth, a perfect replica of the impossible grin he had seen downstairs, opened slowly, wider than any human jaw could. It wasn't just the figure. The thing it was kneeling over was not a box or old furniture. It was another pumpkin. But this one was half-carved. The fibrous hand of the scarecrow thing was holding a tool, a knife made of dark, sharpened obsidian, and it was working. The glistening pile beside it. It was a heap of seeds, pulp, and gore, steaming slightly in the cold air. The scarecrow carver rose, its movements jerky and unnatural, the wet scrape of its burlap legs shifting on the floor. It held the obsidian blade pointed at Elias. "The harvest is perpetual," a voice whispered, though its lips did not move. It was a voice like dry leaves blowing across concrete, sharp and low. "And the grin is for the new crop." Elias turned and scrambled back toward the trapdoor, but he didn't make it. The scarecrow moved with a speed that defied its skeletal form, closing the gap in 2 horrific strides. The last thing Elias Thorne saw was the burning coal of its eyes and the terrifying, impossible perfection of its jagged smile before the obsidian blade came down. Downstairs, the heavy mahogany table was spotless. The front door was still sealed tight. The only source of light in the entire house was the perfect, shining jack-o'-lantern, resting smugly in the hall. The light within it began to flicker again, but this time, it was not the light of a candle. It was the frantic pulse of a fresh heart. And for just a brief moment, the grin of the jack-o'-lantern seemed to hold a flicker of familiar, horrified human recognition, a silent scream trapped in the rind. Then the light stabilized, returning to its steady, smug glow. The grin settled, waiting patiently for the next unwary soul to stop and admire the perfect craft of the pumpkin that had suddenly, inexplicably, appeared on the porch on Halloween night. Story 2. The Deep Cold Mire. A Tale of Coastal Erasure. The first thing Arthur noticed about Port Narrows wasn't the smell of salt, but the pervasive, bone-deep dampness. It was a saturation that clung to the air like a shroud, penetrating his coat, his sweater, and finally, his very belief in a dry existence. It was Halloween night, and the Atlantic had decided to celebrate with a nor'easter of biblical intensity. The rain wasn't falling. It was being hurled horizontally against the windows of the dilapidated Mariner's Inn, each gust sounding like a frustrated fist striking glass. Arthur checked his antique watch. 11 p.m. An hour to midnight, and the storm was reaching its peak. Arthur Vance was a man who collected forgotten places. A historical cartographer by trade, he chased the ghosts of vanished towns and erased names, but Port Narrows was different. The town itself hadn't vanished. Its people had. Over the last 3 centuries, entire families had simply ceased to be. Not dead, but gone, leaving behind their dinners half-eaten and their beds unslept in. The local police, when they bothered to file reports, always noted a commonality: a massive, unprecedented high tide preceding the disappearance, and an inexplicable sense of cold within the empty homes. Arthur was here to find the cartographical error, the historical blind spot, that explained the cold. He sat in the inn's dimly lit common room, the only guest, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like rust. The innkeeper, an ancient, stoic woman named Agnes who possessed eyes the color of sea ice, had retired hours ago, leaving a single kerosene lamp burning low. The electricity, naturally, had failed at sundown. The only other light came from the lightning flashes, which briefly illuminated the room's unsettling decor. Faded nautical maps where entire islands were labeled simply void, and dark, oil paintings of ships foundering on rocks that were shaped uncannily like enormous, grasping fingers. Arthur rose, rubbing the tension from his neck. The inn was built right on the harbor's edge, and he could feel the deep, rhythmic vibration of the storm surge beneath the floorboards. His room, the only one deemed habitable, was on the second floor, directly overlooking the main square, which was already flooded. He decided to retrieve his recorder from his luggage. He had a theory that sound, specifically, the sound of the ocean at an anomalous frequency, was linked to the disappearances. He climbed the creaking, water-warped staircase. Each step was a lament from the wood. As he reached the landing, a single, sustained lightning flash lit the hallway. In that stark, momentary white light, Arthur saw something that made his breath catch. A dark, perfectly circular stain on the worn runner rug, directly outside his door. It wasn't the brown of mildew, it was the intense, deep black of pitch. He approached cautiously. The stain was roughly the size of a dinner plate. He knelt and touched it. It was cold. Not merely cool from the damp air, but cold in a way that defied the ambient temperature of the room. It felt like holding a chunk of submerged granite on a freezing day. And it was wet. Not with rain or seawater, but a viscous, slick moisture that smelled vaguely of ozone and something intensely, biologically foreign, like deep-sea kelp, or perhaps something even older. He quickly unlocked his door and stepped inside. The room was sparsely furnished. A heavy oak bed, a desk cluttered with his maps and notes, and a single window facing the square. He pulled his leather-bound notebook and a digital recorder from his suitcase. As he did so, he heard a sound from the floor below that wasn't the storm. It was a shuffling, followed by a series of distinct, slow drips. Arthur peered into the hallway. The black stain was gone. The runner rug was now uniformly faded and dry. He told himself the lightning had played a trick, or the stain was part of the runner's original pattern, but the memory of the freezing, slick touch on his fingertip was too vivid. He descended the stairs slowly, holding the heavy recorder like a weapon. The shuffling sounds were louder now, coming from the common room. He reached the bottom step and looked in. The room was almost entirely submerged. The flood waters from the storm had breached the front wall. The kerosene lamp was floating near the hearth, its light still flickering, casting distorted, elongated shadows that writhed across the ceiling. The water was ankle deep, opaque, and cold enough to steal the feeling from his feet instantly. And in the center of the room, standing completely still in the murky water, was Agnes, the innkeeper. "Agnes," Arthur called, his voice barely audible over the wind's howl. "The floor is flooded. Are you all right?" She turned slowly. She was wearing the same heavy, dark woolen dress she had worn earlier. Her face was expressionless, her sea ice eyes fixed on him. But she was not holding the light, or a mop, or anything at all. Her hands hung limp at her sides. And her feet were bare. "The tide is high, Mr. Vance." Her voice was a flat, low monotone, devoid of the weary warmth it had held earlier. It was a sound scraped from the bottom of a well. "High tide always brings the cold. You need to get out of the water, Agnes," Arthur insisted, taking a careful step onto the flooded floor. The water instantly numbed his shins. Agnes didn't move. She just stared at him, and her head tilted, just slightly, like a curious animal. "The cold is the truth of this place. We lose our edges in the cold. We lose our names." As she spoke, Arthur watched in mounting horror as the thick woolen fabric of her dress began to absorb the water not just through wetting, but through a strange process of ingestion. The fabric darkened, becoming an impenetrable, seamless black. Where her skin should have been, around her neck and wrists, the color was also deepening, taking on the bruised, metallic sheen of a deep water creature. Arthur noticed her eyes were now totally black. Irises, pupils, everything. They reflected the flickering kerosene lamp-like twin, polished obsidian stones. "Agnes, this isn't you," Arthur pleaded, taking a step back toward the stairs. "No," she confirmed, her voice now layered with a faint, gurgling undertone, like water trapped in a pipe. "It is the deep." As she stepped toward him, the water around her legs did not splash or ripple. It parted, leaving two perfectly dry circles on the submerged floor where her feet had rested. She was walking through the water without displacing it. Terror gave way to a desperate, cold rationality. Arthur knew he couldn't fight her. He turned and scrambled up the stairs, his cold, wet shoes slipping on the warped wood. He raced to his room, slammed the door shut, and threw the heavy oak desk against it. He scrambled to the window, pulling back the mildewed curtains. Outside, Port Narrows Square was a churning lake. But the floodlights on the old docks, which had been dark for decades, were now flickering on, one by one, illuminating the square in a sickly, green-blue phosphorescence. He could see figures moving in the light. They were too tall, too thin, and their movements were synchronized, slow, and jerky, like puppets being pulled by invisible, waterlogged strings. They weren't fighting the flood. They were wading into it, their dark clothes slicked to their limbs. And they all seemed to be heading in the same direction, toward the Mariner's Inn. Arthur recognized the vague shapes of three long-vanished locals from a photograph he'd seen, the Miller family, gone in 1956. The sight broke Arthur's cartographer's discipline. He was witnessing an erasure event. From behind him, the force of the Agnes thing hitting the door rattled the glass in the window pane. Thump, thump, thump. Not a battering ram, but a patient, heavy pressure, applied rhythmically, accompanied by the gurgling sound. Arthur grabbed his camera and recorder, stuffing them into his coat. He couldn't go out the main door. He looked around wildly. The window. He unlatched the heavy, double-paned glass and shoved it open. The wind immediately attacked him, driving the freezing rain deep into his face. He looked down. It was a 40-foot drop onto the flooded square. He was trapped. Then, he remembered Agnes's words. High tide brings the cold. And the strange, dry circles left by her feet. He looked across the roofline of the neighboring structures, which were all about 10 feet lower than the inn. If he could reach the roof of the adjacent abandoned post office, he might have a chance. He grabbed the nearest sturdy object, a heavy, brass bedpost ornament that looked like a tarnished siren, and smashed the windowpane beside the frame, creating a makeshift exit hole. He carefully climbed out onto the narrow, slippery window ledge, the wind threatening to peel him away and cast him into the swirling water below. The thumping on the door stopped. Instead, he heard the faint, slow creak of the lock mechanism giving way, followed by a sound that chilled him more than the storm. The slow, wet slish of bare feet crossing the floorboards inside his room. Arthur jumped. It was less a leap of faith than a simple giving up to gravity. He slammed onto the wet, angled roof of the post office, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He slid briefly, tearing his coat on a rusty antenna, before managing to grip a loose shingle. He lay there for a minute, recovering, before crawling to the apex of the roof. He looked back at the inn. The window of his room was empty, but the dark, water-soaked figure of Agnes was now standing on the sill, perfectly framed. Her head was tilted, her black eyes following him. And as she watched him, the wind seemed to quiet, and the sound of the rain was selectively muted, replaced by a low, powerful hum. The hum wasn't coming from the storm or the building. It was coming from Agnes. It was a single, pure, low-frequency tone that vibrated in Arthur's chest cavity, not his ears. He fumbled with his recorder, turning it on and pointing it at her. The meters immediately spiked, showing a frequency far below the normal human voice range, a subsonic wave that seemed to carry an impossible weight of absence. As the hum intensified, the figure of Agnes began to change. Her limbs seemed to lengthen, becoming unnaturally slender. The skin of her hands, now entirely black, stretched over elongated fingers that ended not in nails, but in pointed, chitinous hooks. Her face blurred, reforming into a seamless, dark expanse, punctuated only by the two black reflective pits of her eyes. She was no longer Agnes. She was a vessel, a hollow shell animated by something ancient and cold. The hum stopped. The creature raised one of its hooked hands and pointed it at Arthur. He turned and fled across the rooftops. The post office roof led to a chain of low, shuttered shops. He ran, sliding on wet asphalt shingles, until he reached the final roof overlooking the main street, where the water was deepest. Down below, the erased figures, the tall, thin men and women in dark, shapeless clothes, had reached the street directly beneath him. They stood in the green-blue glow of the dock lights, looking up. Their faces were all the same. Smooth, black, and utterly blank, like freshly poured tar. And they were all humming. A collective, low, resonant drone that was shaking the foundation of the town. The sound was not a threat, it was an invitation. An offering of peace, of pure, cold oblivion. Arthur realized the truth. The entity, the deep cold mire, didn't want to kill them. It wanted to reclaim them. It was a consciousness made of water and cold, and the disappearances were just an assimilation, an exchange of a warm, messy human identity for a cold, pure, eternal state of existence within the collective consciousness of the tide. He looked down at the street. The water was now lapping at the height of the shop windows. He couldn't jump. He was surrounded by the blank-faced chorus. He looked at his hands, which were shaking uncontrollably, his skin already pale and cold. He was losing feeling, not just from the weather, but from the presence of the mire. His own name, Arthur Vance, suddenly seemed like a silly, unimportant concept. Why bother with the effort of being Arthur? Why not simply be cold? The siren ornament he had used to smash the window was still clutched in his hand. He looked at it, tarnished brass shaped like a mythical temptress. It was an object of heat and human craft. He knew what he had to do to break the song. He had to create a sound that defied the mire's perfect, pure, cold resonance. He needed a sound of warmth, of messy, complicated, unique humanity. He grabbed the metal antenna jutting from the roof, a lightning rod perhaps, and with a sudden surge of adrenaline, he swung the heavy brass siren ornament like a hammer, striking the antenna again and again. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was hideous. A chaotic, unpitched, metallic scream that resonated not with the building, but with the angry, frantic pulse of a heart still beating. The collective hum of the figures in the street immediately warped. The black faces looked up in confusion, the pure, cold melody fractured by the discordant, ugly noise. The mire was momentarily disorganized. Arthur kept striking, filling the air with the sound of desperate, individual existence. He was drowning out the mire's siren song with a cacophony of life. Then, one of the figures, the tall, thin shape he knew was the vanished Mr. Miller, took a single, impossibly long stride and climbed the wall of the shop beneath him. Its long, hooked fingers scrabbled for purchase on the wet brick. Arthur knew he had seconds. He aimed his final, most powerful blow at the brass ornament, splitting the metal. The final crack was so loud it broke the glass in the shop window below, and the chaotic noise, amplified by the brass's shattering resonance, was a physical blow to the creature on the wall. The dark figure recoiled, its black face momentarily contorting into a perfect, silent scream of painful clarity. The creature tumbled back into the water with a heavy splash. Arthur didn't wait. He slid down the steep roof pitch and jumped, not into the flooded street, but onto the narrow window ledge of the shop below. From there, he smashed the glass with his shoe and plunged inside the cramped, dark space, finding himself in the mildewed aisle of what looked like an antique bait shop. He didn't stop until he reached the rear door. He kicked the waterlogged wood until it gave way, collapsing into the back alley. The alley was higher ground and less flooded. He sprinted, never looking back at the dock lights, running until the roar of the wind and the rain were the only sounds he could hear. He ran for miles, finally collapsing on the hard, dry ground outside the town limits, where the road turned inland toward the next settlement. He lay there for a long time, shivering, until the dawn broke gray and cold over the horizon. The storm was receding, leaving a world scoured clean. When he finally reached for his pocket to check the recorder, he found it was gone, lost in the chaotic escape. Only his notebook, waterlogged but intact, remained. He opened the notebook to his last entry, a map of Port Narrows, marked with symbols charting the areas of highest disappearance rates. But beneath the cartography, scrawled in his own hand, were words he didn't remember writing. The cold is the truth. The memory is a lie. And as Arthur Vance, the cartographer, stood up, beginning the long walk away from Port Narrows, he realized something terrifying. He could remember the cold, the terror, the creature in Agnes's skin. He could remember running. But when he tried to picture his own face, the faces of his family, or even the name of the university where he taught, there was only a vast, empty space. A void. The mire had been broken, but its song had found its way in. It had taken a little piece of the perfect warmth it craved, leaving a little cold, blank space behind. He looked back at the town, now obscured by morning mist and the lingering spray of the receding tide. He knew his research was finished. He simply didn't know why he had started it. He walked inland, a tired man with no history, searching not for a lost town, but for the lost memory of his own name. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.